Yeah.
So the question before, basically a boat also, it's your choice to take the boat.
Right? Same idea. Who asked you to get in there? Right? But what's the issue? What's the obvious question on this svara? What? A little bit, but say it a little better. You could say what?
The fact is, you were in danger, and now you're safe.
True.
What about when you can't, like, meaning you can fly, you can drive, let's say.
It's true. I could fly. I could drive for 3.5 hours to Manchester, but that's crazy. Or I have business.
Or you're going from here to, let's say.
Well, that's all right. Right. So that you can't do. Also, right? It's not subjective. It's if you look in the Chelek Gimel, he says, look, right? Already you know the Yehuda, the Rav Cheskel said that. First of all, this is what's called normal way of life already, right? Especially people who are traveling business. But for sure, for business, you're allowed to do this. And who says like it's called in davar l'shiur? There's no shiurim here, right? Again, I could have flown to Baltimore. I could have driven to Baltimore, but let's say I'm on a business. I don't have time, like I did from Manchester, to waste my whole day, 3.5 hours there, 3.5 hours back. That's crazy. Makes more sense to fly for half an hour. Yeah.
But if the whole point, if half the reason that the Tzitzilas are saying that you should say is because you actually are still crossing a river, crossing a desert, and still driving doesn't solve the problem. You're still crossing that same desert, you're still crossing the same river.
Maybe less chance.
Maybe the question is if that's considered, but it's maybe not considered as much sakana then. At that point, if you're just driving on a highway, maybe that's what he was saying. It's not as much of a danger in that point.
What about the
Maybe.
statistical factor of driving? Like,
Right. So that's where it comes. So I will tell you. We'll get to that in a second. So the bottom line of the Tzitz Eliezer, if you see his conclusion, he says, "Miu betisa me'ir le'ir b'ota medina, ubefrat kishezel lokeach only an hour or two." He does give a certain estimation of time. Pachot yoter, like I think if you fly to Florida, basically from New York, near the in levarech, kazman katzar kazeh b'ota medina. He basically truncates the sakana and the chances of danger. So just to finish up the last piece, Rav Ovadia basically says that the Svardim go the total all the way, and he says any trip that's more than a parsa, because he learned from Tfilas Haderech, anything of a shah of a chomesh, 72 minutes. Any idea of 72 minutes, he says that you do have to say Birkat HaGomel, and that would include a bus ride, a taxi. If I took a taxi from New York to Boston, okay, those 5 hours, 4 hours, 3 hours, you'd have to say Birkat HaGomel, according to Rav Ovadia, because he basically says the parsa, and it goes by the amount of the 72 minutes. Yeah. What? That's a different shiur. We'll get to that. The question at Tfilas Derech is a whole different shiur about when, how much, when he's supposed to do it. But that also is a din parsa. We'll conclude just with a nice Chatam Sofer that at the end he says, if you look at all the psukim, right, he actually splits up the three. And the Chatam Sofer says that for the first three, it says v'yizbechu zivchei todah. I quoted for you half the mizvah here in Pasuk Chav Bet. It said v'yizbechu zivchei todah v'yisapru ma'asav berina. There you should make a korban todah, right? But as opposed to the next pasuk, which is Yordei Hayam, which concludes with Pasuk Al Mebet v'yiramum b'kalam moshav zkenim yalu, that owned by Yordei Hayam, right? Ki'ilu, where you put yourself in that sakana, and your nimsa l'bnu shamayim ki rabim rachma v'lo b'dei b'alechayim akorchach. It's less eno chayiv korban ela romain b'kalam, as it says v'yiromu b'kalam, and trade the rabbanan. Nemtza lefizet tlat kamaita. The first three have a distinction that you would actually need to v'yizbechu zevach todah in principle. V'lo tzrichi, you not need a kalam and moshav zkenim. Versus the Yordei Hayam, fundamentally it'd be different. I'll tell you the nafkamina with this possibly. Again, I'm not saying lahalach lamaisa, but there are big things because of tircha de tzibura, that there's an issue that let's say there are 10 people that flew. So a nohag in many shuls is that one person says Birkas HaGomel for many people. The problem with that, in theory, would be that it might be different, like in this case of the Chatam Sofer, if you were Yordei Hayam, might be different than a person who was Cholev Shnit Rapeh, right? According to the Chatam Sofer, only up to Yordei Hayam, they're actually a Chiv, a Korban, and it might be what's called a different Birkat HaGomel, with Kiv Eger also. same type of, also had that safek that it might be a problem to be motzi, but the mainstream practice definitely is to be motzi. I'll end off just with a couple of things that Rav Shlomo Zalman said that I thought was very interesting. Number one is, since it is a danger, so Rav Shlomo Zalman very much did not like people flying during the 9 days. But even a Talmud who had to go, what's interesting is a Talmud who had to leave home to go early, whatever, let's say he was a madrich in camp, I'm not sure that happened in his yeshiva, but he had to go home early. He only allowed them from Rosh Chodesh, from the 9 days, because he didn't want them to be mevatel limud Torah. However, interestingly enough, he says to come to Israel, he said even on Tisha B'Av itself, even just to visit, even just visiting, if it's not mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which is a machlokes, but that's what he was saying, even to come to Israel, he would say you were able to fly. The last piece, which I didn't understand, is the question. Rav Shlomo Zalman says flying for 1 day you would make Birkat HaGomel. That I understood, but he said if you rest, meaning if you basically had a stopover for 3 hours, right, and then you got back onto the plane, you wouldn't have to say like 2 of them. Again, according to Rav Moshe's piece, meaning you got saved from one plane and now you have another plane, so you should have to say Birkat HaGomel a second time. So I'm not sure why there'd be a difference if I stayed for 3 hours, if it's short, let's say, versus if I stayed overnight. I mean, on some level, misvara, it's like there's some sort of nituk, there's some sort of separation between the first flight and the other flight. Didn't really make so much sense to me. Everyone should have a good night.